This is a response to a question from a Patreon community member, Wesley Wooten. He asks a question I'm asked fairly often, and so I thought it would be useful to offer this answer. Here's the question. In discussions about China's economic growth, when there's enough honesty around to acknowledge what it has been over the last 25, 30 years, which is namely the fastest economic growth of any country on this planet, and when it is further acknowledged that the fastest growing economy across the 20th century was the Soviet Union, and the fastest growing economy of the 21st century, at least so far, is the People's Republic of China, when you can admit that and begin the conversation from there, two kinds of responses have been made. First, there are those who grudgingly acknowledge that if the economic growth, the speed of it, is an important matter, and in all poor countries, if not the most important, it is among the 2 or 3 most important objectives people in such countries have for all the obvious reasons. If you acknowledge all of that and you recognize that, the defense of capitalism perspective comes back as follows. Here's the argument. Okay, yes, the Chinese have been growing really quickly, but that's because they have been adopting more and more capitalist ideas, capitalist practices. More and more of their enterprises are privately owned and operated. More and more reliance on the market rather than government planning. So, this argument goes, yes, they've grown quickly, but that's because they've moved towards capitalism. It's the capitalism that accounts for their speed. Here's the problem with that argument, which really isn't so hard to see. First, the Soviet Union didn't do those things that China has done. It didn't open a large part of its industry to private enterprise, and it did not subordinate its planning mechanism to the market, and yet it still grew faster than capitalist economies. Number two, it's still the case that the most capitalist economies, that is, in that language, the economies that have the least role for the government compared to China, have not therefore been faster. In other words, the more capitalist you are, it's not the case, the faster you grow. The inescapable conclusion, if you're not too blocked from seeing it ideologically, is simply this. Yes, the Chinese have moved in a direction of allowing more private enterprise and allowing more market activity relative to what the Chinese had before. The Chinese call that socialism with particularly Chinese characteristics. You might describe it in economics as though it is a very complicated mixture of some private enterprise, some government enterprise, much more than you have in most capitalist economies, and then a government communist party that oversees both the private and the public sector to make sure they get the kind of economic growth that they have achieved. Is this socialism? There's a big debate among socialists as to whether it is. On the one hand, there are those who have always defined socialism as government owning the means of production and government planning. For them, China is still, to a significant degree, that, even though it has opened itself up to more private ownership and markets. But for people who don't identify socialism that way, who look at socialism more in terms of the relationship in production, the employer-employee relationship as capitalists versus the collective democratization of the enterprise, enterprises in which all the workers together are both employers of themselves and employees of themselves, what we can shorthandedly call a worker co-op. If that's what your idea of socialism is, then yes, the Chinese don't have that, The Russians didn't do much with that either. That remains a kind of socialism, a definition of socialism that's on the agenda. But the cheap effort to describe what the Chinese have done with their massive control by the government of both the private and the public sectors, to say that that incredible economic growth is somehow peculiarly the contribution of just the private capitalist sector, that's not warranted theoretically or empirically or based on any real evidence. Thank you, Wesley Wooten, for your question. I hope you have found this answer interesting.